Well, welcome to Bible class. We're glad that you're here with us, and we're excited to begin a new book on Wednesday. This is Habakkuk, the prophet who questioned God, and we're going to do the introduction today. Not a long introduction, a short introduction for the most part. We're going to talk about the man, the date, the background, the keywords and verses of the book, as well as an outline and lessons. And so let's begin with the man. Habakkuk's name means embrace. We know really nothing definite about Habakkuk except what we can find and glean from the book. Now, some Jewish writers would say that Habakkuk was a Levi, but we really don't have any proof to support that. And some have also suggested that his home was in Jerusalem, but again, we're not certain. All that we know about Habakkuk is what we find in the book and his name's meaning, which is embrace. The date of Habakkuk, if we look at the oppressor in Habakkuk, it's Babylon or Chaldea, which came to power at the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC. And Babylon carried the first citizens of Judah into captivity in 606 BC. Therefore, the writing of Habakkuk would have to fall between 612 and 606 BC. The background of Habakkuk is basically the idea of what Judah has been given to. They've been given to idolatry, violence, greed, materialism, and the last good king of Judah, Josiah, had been killed at Megiddo, and his wicked and unworthy sons succeeded him on the throne. 2 Kings 23:39 through chapter 24 and verse 20. And the coming of Babylon to destroy Jerusalem and carry the nation into captivity was imminent, 2 Kings 25. Jeremiah, Zephaniah, and Nahum were contemporaries of Habakkuk. We just finished the book of Nahum. And God was going to use Babylon to punish Judah. And he would then punish Babylon for her sins. Judah finally fell in 586 BC when Jerusalem is destroyed, and Babylon was conquered by the Medes and Persians in 539 BC. In 536 BC, the Jews returned from Babylonian captivity, ending their 70-year period of the punishment that began in 606 BC, Jeremiah 25, 8 through 14. If I were to tell you what the key words of this book are, according to Jensen's survey of the Old Testament, the key words are why and woe. Why and woe. And the key verses, according to Jensen's survey, as well as the notes that I got while I was at the Memphis School of Preaching, the key verses from Jensen's survey are chapter 2 and verse 2, chapter 2 and verse 20, chapter 3 and verse 2, but the key verse in Habakkuk is Habakkuk 2:4, where the just shall live by his faith. It's quoted 3 times in the New Testament. In fact, in Romans 1:17, it is written, the just shall live by faith. Galatians 3:11, it is written that by the law in the sight of God is evident, for the just shall live by faith. And Hebrews 10:38, now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. People today want to act like the Old Testament isn't worth reading and studying anymore. I remember hearing a story of a preacher who was told they didn't want him preaching any from the Old Testament anymore. And so he told them, well, then I can't preach from the New Testament. And they said, what do you mean? We're just telling you not to preach from the Old Testament. The New Testament's wide open. You take as much from that as you want. And his response was, okay, let's go to Matthew chapter 1. And he began to read the genealogy of Jesus, and he stopped and said, who's that? What's this person's story? And the point he was making was, you can't tell the story of Christ without the Old Testament. Christians can't understand the full will of God without looking at both testaments to see what we can learn, Romans 15:4, from the Old Testament. It's not that it's a salvation thing, that we find salvation in the Old Testament. We don't. But there is much to be learned from that book. And even there, just 3 verses in the New Testament that came from one singular passage in an Old Testament book of Habakkuk. Let's outline the book together. The first point of this outline would be that the prophet's perplexity. Chapter 1, verses 1 through chapter 2 and verse 3. And his first question is, how can God be indifferent to the wickedness among his people? Habakkuk 1, 1 through 4. And God replies, I am not indifferent, but I will use the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, to punish my people. Verses 5 through 11. Habakkuk comes back with a second question saying, well, how can a perfect God use a perverse people to punish his people? Chapter 1, verses 12 through 17. God's reply is, my punishment upon my people is certain. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Now, from chapter 2, verses 4 through 20, it's God's promise of punishment upon the Chaldeans. Righteous men stand in their time of trouble by their faith, verse 4. The just shall live by his faith. But in contrast, the wicked who are intoxicated by power and pride will perish. Chapter 2 and verse 5. Now, verses 6 through 20 of chapter 2 is the prophet pronouncing a series of woe upon the Chaldeans. And here are the reasons why. 5 reasons woe was pronounced. Number 1, woe because of the land conquest, verses 6 through 8. Woe because of building an empire by cruelty and oppression, verses 9 through 11. Woe because of building cities by blood, chapter 2, 12 through 14. Woe because of degrading conquered nations, 2 verses 15 through 17. And woe because of worshiping idols. Let me stop for just a second here and let's consider what we've learned so far from these Chaldeans. Woe because of the land conquest. Woe because of building an empire by cruelty and oppression. Woe because of building cities by blood, degrading conquered nations, worshiping idols. Can the United States of America fall under these categories as well? No doubt we could. We spent so much time talking in Nahum about the idea that we are not that different from Nineveh, in that if we have the mindset of Nineveh, we will fall like Nineveh. Habakkuk's going to carry the same thing. It's just a different people. I kept getting mixed up in my Nahum series and calling Nineveh Babylon a lot of times. Well, that's the Chaldeans that come after Nineveh. But the story is the same. It's just a different people. That's why they're so interchangeable. Chaldea is no different from Nineveh, and Nineveh is no different from Chaldea. Both would be destroyed. But so were God's people that were worthy of destruction destroyed. The last part of this book is chapter 3, 1 through 19, which is the prophet's prayer. He makes a petition, I should say, verses 1 through 2. And then he looks at the past in verses 3 through 15. And then he has patience in verses 16 through 19. Let's close with some lessons from this book that we need to keep before our minds. Number 1, God does not reject a sincere seeker. Habakkuk was sincere. Now, he did question God, and he asked God, how can you do this? But God did not reject the sincerity of Habakkuk. Number 2, God can be trusted in any crisis. We've learned a lot about that, haven't we? Number 3, God is working out his will in history, even though men may not be able to see it. Number 4, evil has within itself the germ of its own destruction. Number 5, one may not know the reason behind everything that happens, but he can trust confidently in the goodness of God. We may not know what the future holds, but we know who's holding the future. Number 6, God uses one nation to punish another, Genesis 15:13 and following, and also Jeremiah 18:7 and following. Number 7, all men and nations are responsible to God's universal moral code, Psalm 9 and verse 17. Nobody is exempt. Someone might say, well, what about the people who don't have the word of God? Are they going to go to hell on the judgment day? According to what we read in Habakkuk, all men and nations are responsible to God's universal moral code. And Romans 3:23 tells me that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Not just those who have the law that tells them what sin is. All men and nations are responsible. Number 8, even if reduced to poverty and hardship, God's people can still rejoice in their salvation, Habakkuk 3:17 through 19. So that's the introduction to the book of Habakkuk. I hope that it was a beneficial short study for you. Not a whole lot to really discuss in this introduction. But next week we'll begin with chapter 1, and we look forward to studying that book together. But until then, we want to thank you for studying with us today, and Lord willing, we'll see you again next week.